Hello and welcome to No Drop. On this episode, I want to cover a topic that's really important for anybody who wants to be very active and just have a really high training load. That could be high intensity, that could be high volume. In times where we are very active, one thing that we need to consider is, are we consuming enough energy? And all that energy comes from food. So this nutrition topic that I want to dive into today deals with how do we deal with incredibly high energy demands. And that is this concept known as necessary garbage. Necessary garbage is essentially the idea that to meet high calorie demands, we need to turn to some junk food in order to supply the amount of calories it takes to sustain that type of activity. There have been times in my own training where I have absolutely connected with this concept because in the past, I have tried to only eat healthy while I'm being really active. So I'm really just trying to eat what is conventionally thought of as what is a healthy diet. Now, I am a huge believer that food is a great way to connect with your health. However, in situations where energy demands are very high, food becomes almost purely energy for me. And that is the primary function of food. The primary function of food is to supply energy to your cells. In these times in the past, when I have attempted to stay on this healthy food only eating path, I was finding that I get maxed out on the amount of calories I can take in per day. So if I'm limited to 3,000, 4,000 calories of healthy food, but I have an activity load during a day that's closer to 6,000 or 7,000 calories, in those times, I need to have tools to be able to meet those calorie demands. Training that hard and going into a deficit can be catastrophic, and it's catastrophic for your performance during your workout, and it's also catastrophic to the long-term progress that you want to make. When you're in a deficit, you don't get to choose where that energy comes from in the body. It becomes a real issue because your body is always consuming a little bit of muscle when you're in a deficit. You could see how that would be a problem. We want to get stronger, we want to train really hard, and yet we're putting ourselves in a state where we might be eating our own muscles. Very negative feedback loop, not an area I want to get into. And that's where these junk foods, this garbage food, becomes necessary. When we have big deficits, there might be a limit to what we can accomplish and what we can replenish through only conventionally healthy food. This topic has been on my mind almost all summer because it's been an amazing summer. I have been riding a ton. Fitness is super high. I'm so happy with how this season has gone. When I looked back, I checked some of my numbers, and over the last 10 weeks, I have been averaging 14 hours a week just cycling. On top of that, I've also been running, I've been doing strength training, I do core work, I walk a lot. I try to walk for most of my errands. In general, this summer, just been really, really active. So this connection with food, this connection with nutrition, and making sure that I'm hitting the appropriate calorie numbers has been very important and very significant. And that's why I wanted to sort of touch on this topic. And maybe, this is one tool. This necessary garbage concept is one tool in the way that we address nutrition. Other ways to meet calorie demands could be prepping meals, could be eating more while you're working out. So this is just one way to address this issue. I do think it is significant enough, though, to cover and to dive into. And on this episode, I want to cover a little bit about what are garbage foods, how can we use them during our workouts, how can we use them after our workouts when we're resting, and then I want to talk a little bit about how we can still try to make the best choices. Two things I really want to drive home before we proceed here is that this idea that food is first and foremost a source of energy is really important for us to grasp. If you are very active, your body is running on energy, and that energy comes from food. That energy comes from macronutrients, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. That's it. We need calories. So much of the conversation around nutrition is calorie restriction, how to eat, the most vegetables and things like that. I love those discussions, but we're pushing those aside right now. We're trying to meet our calorie requirements. The second concept to connect with is that nutrition is very dynamic. It's so easy and so simple to just look at, oh, that's a bad food, that's a good food. That does not exist, especially when you're active. I had a nutrition professor once who explained it to me. There are no bad foods. There is only bad timing. And what he meant by that was that how we use our foods, when we use our foods, what state is our body in when we're turning to these foods, that is what matters. So nutrition is dynamic. Our needs change. No one thing is good or bad. Everything just is what it is. And it's up to us to have the knowledge to use it appropriately. And food is primarily energy. Let's remember those two ideas as we move forward on this topic of necessary garbage. Many of the foods that fall into this necessary garbage category have similar features to them. So these are foods that are going to be incredibly calorie dense. And by calorie dense, we're talking about macronutrients. So we're talking about those sources of energy, carbs, fats, protein. They are often going to be void of basically anything else that food has to offer. So very low in vitamins and minerals typically. These are really things that just have energy in them. They're also typically low in fiber. Fiber is not a source of energy. It is very good for your body, but there is no energy in fiber. So typically these foods, either because they're processed or naturally they don't have a lot of fiber, they're going to be low fiber foods. These foods often are high glycemic index. Glycemic index, for those who don't know, is a rating that essentially tells you how much is this going to spike my blood sugar level. Something very low, something like a 10 or a 0 would be, maybe like a leafy green or something like that, something with very little sugar in it, very high fiber. Something with a very high rating, like 100 on the glycemic index, would be like a spoonful of sugar. A lot of these foods are going to be towards the top end of that glycemic index rating, which means that they have a lot of sugar in them and very low fiber. Most of the time, a lot of these foods will also be very processed. These are going to be packaged foods. They're going to be foods like cereal, packaged pastries. They could be candy, baked goods. things that you find in the frozen food aisle. A lot of food from restaurants is going to fall under this category. Even performance nutrition, like powders or gels, those products, just because they are marketed well and packaged well, those products are candy. They are pure sugar. They would be horrible for your body if you were not active. That gives us a better idea of kind of what these necessary garbage foods are. Now, let's look at how can we use these when we're active and when we're not active. We can use and prioritize different characteristics of these foods to benefit our short-term and long-term training. The first way I use these garbage foods when I'm active is actually to provide energy for my cells when I'm working out. So I'm fueling my workout with some of these foods. The kind of general rule that I follow is, as my intensity picks up, I'm turning more and more to things that are pure sugar. So if I was doing a hard, sustained effort, something like a carb mix that I could have mixed in a bottle of water would be very easy to consume. It would basically be pure glucose. And by the way, glucose is the type of sugar that we're looking for here when we do these things. Glucose comes from flour, it comes from bread, glucose comes from corn syrup. If you see performance products where dextrose or maltodextrin is the primary ingredient, those are pure forms of glucose. That is what our body wants when we are working out intensely. So that is the first way that I would use these foods. And I want to dig a little bit deeper on why these are great. These foods and how processed they are is really advantageous. These things that make them, when we're not active, really bad for us are the things that make them perfect for a workout. So these processed foods, these foods that are low in fiber, that is exactly what our body wants to get quick energy delivered to our cells. And the more we can supply that constant flow of energy, the better we'll be able to perform. And if you can train yourself to take in more calories, then you can perform better. You're not going into deficits. You can sustain efforts longer. I'm a huge fan of consuming food during my workouts. So building a connection to that and knowing what foods to turn to is so incredibly amazing. So that is how I would address my calorie needs while I'm active. Immediately post-workout would be the second opportunity I see to use some of these foods. Immediately post-workout, we'll dig into a little bit of science here. Immediately post-workout, you have about a 30-minute window in which your cells can continue to absorb glucose without insulin being present. That window is the most open right after your workout, and then it slowly closes, and after about 30 minutes, it's completely closed. Now your cells can no longer absorb glucose without insulin being present. So now pure forms of glucose are going to become potentially negative. So in that 30-minute window, I'm trying to cram in all the glucose that I need to replenish the glycogen stores in my muscles. By fueling yourself after your workout, what that does is it sets me up for the next day to be successful and to have energy. Those glycogen stores are crucial for feeling fresh, for being able to perform. So after my workout, I'm going to turn to some of these same necessary garbage foods, processed foods, things with corn syrup in them, to deliver the recovery energy that I need to replenish my reserves. But again, these goals can't be accomplished with quote unquote healthy food. This junk food, these garbage foods, are absolutely critical for maintaining high levels of performance. Both of those are really accurate examples of how I use these foods to fuel my active states and to keep my activity going. When I'm not working out, I'm still turning to some of these foods. If I am having weeks or months where I am training really, really hard, I'm doing really well at eating during my workouts, I'm still going to go out of those workouts in a deficit. A 7,000 or 8,000 calorie day is a lot of work, and those are not uncommon for me. Since I can't get all of the calories that I need during the workout, I might have to attach to some of these junk foods after the workout in order to top off my calorie reserves. Now, we're probably looking at things that aren't just focused on carbohydrates. These could be things that are heavier in fats and heavier in proteins. I'm not so much looking for the performance aspects of these foods, so much as I'm turning to the just amazing calorie density of some of these foods. When I do cook at home, I might turn to frozen foods or packaged foods that make cooking, one, easier, and two, less healthy, so more calorie dense. That's one thing that I'm looking for. And three, more flavorful. Nutrition is more than just calories and nutrients. Food provokes emotions. Food can give us comfort. Food can make us calm and make us less stressed. These are all really important things to connect with, especially if you're stressed out by a high training load. So to be able to turn to more flavorful things, these foods, some of them like a pizza, so stimulating with flavor, that can be really, really powerful. If you're just having garbanzo beans and spinach, that can get tiring. You can season that up and dress it up any way that you like, but it's not going to hit some of those emotional notes. That is part of the complexity of food. How do we keep ourselves excited to eat? That is just as valuable of an aspect of this necessary garbage as is the energy delivery. Just the fact that it keeps us engaged in our eating is really important. If you're somebody who maybe you haven't dabbled in the world of high volume training, and I think high volume for me, this becomes something that I think of when I'm kind of starting to get over that 10 hours a week number. 10 hours and up, I'm definitely thinking about food. 16 hours and up, I'm absolutely thinking about food. If you haven't dabbled in that world yet, this might sound a little strange that, oh, how hard can it be to eat more? Food is so great. But let me tell you, it gets really challenging sometimes. If you don't have a lot of time, if your work schedule is busy and you're training a lot, suddenly you start to slip and you miss 500 calories here, 1,000 calories there. Those deficits are incredibly dangerous if you're training a lot. So if you're yet to dive into that type of training, be mindful of this when you do. When you do connect with really active weeks, if you start to feel run down, if your sleep is getting disrupted, if you're getting mentally drained, start to reflect back and just think, have I eaten enough energy? Now, necessary garbage isn't an excuse to only eat bad foods. The way that I connect with this is that I try to keep my foundation of healthy eating. So as I mentioned earlier in the episode, maybe that's around 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day that I can get with good quality, nutrient-dense food. Then on top of that, I stack these garbage foods, these processed foods, these foods that are not the best choices to make, but again, this is necessary. These foods become a necessity for me because the only other alternative is to not get the energy, and that is not an option for me. So don't only turn to those foods. Still be focused on your typical healthy, well-rounded nutrition. And then on top of that, stack this stuff so that you're topping off your energy, but also getting the good fibers, vegetables, all the great things that food can do for us. We're still making that the foundation, and we're just putting this on top. And with those garbage foods too, we do still have room to make better choices. What is the best bad choice I can make is an interesting way to think about it. An example of that, let's say that we had one food option that had a lot of preservatives in it, and we had another food option that had slightly less preservatives. An example of that would be like some sort of packaged toaster pastry. You have that on one hand, or you have like a peanut butter sandwich with maybe some berries and maybe some maple syrup or honey. Now, metabolically, those things are going to seem like they're the same thing to your body. If you ate those and just looked at what it did to your blood sugar, they would probably be very similar in a negative way. However, that packaged pastry is very likely going to have a lot more preservatives, and it's going to be a lot more processed than the sandwich with peanut butter and some berries and some maple syrup or some honey. So there's room to still make good choices within this. It doesn't all have to be, cookies and candy. We can still eat things that, are just a little bit better. And I definitely try to stay connected with that. One thing that I'll do is the closer I am to a workout, the more I'll give myself some slack. So maybe I'll turn to those packaged foods while I'm on the bike. And then after I immediately get off of it, and then maybe an hour or two later, I'll still do things that are very calorie dense and not the greatest choices in the scheme of nutritional health, but I need the calories, and I know that they're not as bad as the other options. So that's one way that I'll sort of connect with that and still try to just be conscious to make the least bad choices. The last thing that I'll mention about necessary garbage and how we pair that to our training is that for me, I don't always train in a way that requires necessary garbage. If I'm training very high volume, or if my training load is very high, that is when I'm implementing these tools to help meet my energy demands. However, I have times in my life where I'm not training with extreme training loads, and my goals are much more reasonable, and my training hours per week are much, much lower. And in those times, I don't have to turn to necessary garbage to meet my energy needs. Because, again, I do believe that food is an amazing way to take care of yourself, an amazing way to promote and sustain health and longevity. That is a belief that I hold true. With that knowledge and with that belief, I can't let myself eat necessary garbage 365 days a year. It's not something I believe in. So I periodize my training. I structure my training so that throughout a year, I do not have to turn to this stuff all the time. I don't think that would be a good decision to make. To have it as a tool when you need it, though, very, very powerful. This is such a fun topic for me. I hope you can hear how fun this topic is. Nutrition is so complex, it's so nuanced, it's so dynamic, it changes with us. To me, that's very exciting. It can be a little bit intimidating at times to know, once you know that there's not just one way to do things, then you've got to empower yourself with more knowledge. So there have been times where it's been intimidating, but through the years I've experimented, I've found what works for me, I've found the right educational sources to empower myself to be able to find the right things. This topic and how peculiar it is, but how much it makes sense is, it just, like, I love it. I love it. It's just so amazing. And if you have found this episode enlightening, you can support the podcast. Dive into the podcast notes, and there you will find a link to a Venmo and a PayPal, and you can support the podcast that way. You can also go to jeffzenfitness.com, and at the top of the website, you'll see a link to that same Venmo and PayPal, and you can support there. I really appreciate it. It just helps the podcast going and helps me create more content moving forward. I have so enjoyed talking about this topic of necessary garbage. As very active people, let's be focused on how much energy are we getting, because that energy is what keeps us moving. So keep on moving, and until next time, ride safe.